The following examples are provided to support field report number 1 on immigration in the cultural landscape. On the screen right now you see two maps. On the right, the city of Perugia in central Italy, and on the left, the small town of Old Forge in northeast Pennsylvania, just southwest of the city of Scranton. These two cities are linked by a migration pathway. Beginning in the late 1800s and running through the mid-1900s, these two cities were connected as immigrants were leaving central Italy and arriving in Pennsylvania. Now their arrival began in New York City through Ellis Island, and then by train these immigrants settled permanently in Old Forge. When we look at this example, when we dig a little deeper and we start to make the connections with the assignment, with field report number 1, the first thing we look at is the migration stream. And this Italian migration was part of the largest voluntary migration in history. 750,000 people a year left between 1898 and 1914. 4 million arrived in the U.S., most of them through New York City. Millions of other Italians went to Brazil and Argentina, where there were fewer cultural barriers to diffusion. Now I use this example because this example is part of my immigration past. My maternal side, my great-grandparents on my mother's side, were part of this migration stream from central Italy to Old Forge, Pennsylvania. They, like many others, were pushed out for a number of reasons. Soil exhaustion put a lot of farmers out of work. The government of Italy at this time focused most of its attention and resources on the urban north, meaning they were looking to urbanize, and they were putting their subsidies, they were putting their money, they were putting their interests and energy towards those industrial businesses. There were a lot of large families, and with those large families there was lack of long-term and short-term opportunity. During this time, around the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, there was a lot of economic growth in the United States. Railroad construction and mining were drawing people to this part of northeast Pennsylvania. The anthracite coal seams near Old Forge attracted my family members, attracted the men on my mother's side. As this migration stream developed, an enclave economy evolved. As that enclave evolved through this established migration stream, we saw this idea of a transnational landscape evolve. I would recommend referencing the Alan Marcus article to get a little bit more depth on transnational landscapes. Beginning in the 1920s, pizza cafes began to open, and these were simple restaurants. Generally, they had a small bar in the front with a restaurant in the back, and they served a unique style of pizza, a style of pizza that is unique to Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Today, this transnational landscape persists, as there's about a dozen pizza cafes in a town of only 8,000 people. So when we examine the cultural landscape, it's dominated by businesses with Italian surnames. So we see how this migration stream from the late 1800s through the mid-1900s really emphasized the impact on the cultural landscape here in northeast Pennsylvania. And as we see these pizza cafes, as we see the businesses with Italian surnames, we see a strong sense of regional identity and pride connected with this Italian-American immigration pathway. So when I dig into this story, I'm going to look at migration. I'm going to look at, through the QB text, why were Italian immigrants arriving in the United States, what were some characteristics of that new wave of immigration. I'm also going to look at location-specific sources on Old Forge, and I'll look at the mining industry, I'll look at local regional identity. For general themes, the required course readings will provide the support you need, but for the location-specific ideas, concepts, information that's not commonly known, you will need to do some research on those individual sites. My photo support, as you can see here, the way I've captioned these photos, Figure 1, Ravello's Cafe, a popular restaurant for locals and visitors. So this is a restaurant that has served the local community for generations, and it's also a restaurant that's known outside of the community. The Figure 2 is an image inside Ravello's that promotes the connection to these pizza cafes. Two more images Figure 3, Elio G's. This is the first pizza cafe in Old Forge. As you can see, these are relatively modest businesses, not too big. Again, generally enough room for from anywhere from a few tables to a dozen tables, and they usually had a small bar in the front. And then the picture on the right is Salerno's, another popular pizza cafe that dates back generations. So by examining my family's past, examining my family's immigration history, I'm able to make some connections that relate to the course readings, and also see these connections, find these connections in the cultural landscape. A second example of the impact of immigration looks at the Irish diaspora. In the 1840s, the potato famine pushed millions of Irish out of Ireland around the world. Many of those immigrants arrived in the United States. So when we look at this migration stream, we look at the push of the potato famine, and in addition, English oppression, to the Irish population at this time. 5 million Irish arrived in the Americas between 1845 and 1850. One of those individuals was named William Ford, and he came from Southern Ireland, County Cork, and he arrived in Quebec in 1846. He later moved to Michigan to be a farmer. So the push factor, again, the potato famine, few opportunities because of discrimination by the English. And the pull factor was economic growth in the United States and urban jobs. As the United States was urbanizing, a lot of these new businesses, a lot of these sites of production needed labor. When we look at the cultural landscape, William had a son named Henry, and Henry started the Ford Motor Company. So while my first example looked at something that was local, a small community with a strong sense of place, a strong connection with its immigrant past, and in my case, a strong personal connection. This example looks at a globally recognized brand. So when we think about the impact of immigration, had William not arrived, had William not survived the potato famine, but the story would have been different. But William Ford, Henry's father, arrived in the Americas in 1846 and later moved to Michigan. His son Henry started Ford Motor Company, revolutionized the way we produced in the United States. So when we think about homogenization, the industrial process, the 40-hour work week, a living wage, the way we mass produce and mass consume, owes much of its beginning to Henry Ford. So this example, again, ties to a distant immigration pathway. My first example, again, the new wave. Many of you may choose to look at the current ethnic kaleidoscope and see how immigrant groups coming from Asia, coming from Africa, coming from Latin America are impacting our cultural landscapes. So there are a number of ways to do this correctly. Make sure that you've identified and support your migration pathway. Make sure that you are interacting. Why does this matter to you? Why is this impacting you? What is your involvement in this? So as long as you're hitting on the keys and the instructions, the migration pathway, the impact on the cultural landscape and sense of place, ideas of regional identity and cultural homogenization, if that plays into it. So take your time, go step by step, reflect on this. Again, this is more than just telling the story about somebody else or another place. You are an integral part of this process.